everyone. Welcome into a very special edition of our Marlow's Matchup. My name is Brandon Adams. This is the former UJL American John Stinchcomb. The reason why I say special is because normally one of the things that the thing we love probably doing more than anything else is being live on location in a Marlow's Tavern. We'll be doing that again very soon. But when we can't be at a Marlow's, we like kind of keeping that vibe going with a lot of your comments and kind of an open forum discussion on this program. This particular Thursday is a different kind of Thursday. Our bosses here at Dog Nation World Headquarters are good enough to allow us not to do that today because if you're watching this live, it is October the 31st. If you have young kids, you know that means Halloween. So, John, you and I both are in kind of that same boat. So, as you watch this show live, just know that John's probably chasing some trick-or-treaters up and down his street. I'm probably doing something close to the same thing. We are in that kind of phase of life. So appreciate the folks from Marlow's, appreciate the folks for Dog Nation, letting us do a little bit different version of this program here today. And obviously it's good to be able to see you. Not live for the audience right now, but we get to be together again. I'm always glad about that.
Oh, it's a good thing for me, and I appreciate the fans out there who are willing to, it's probably raining right now, I'm guessing, if it's live.
Actually, we may have a bigger audience than normal if trick-or-treating gets rained out. People are just like gathering in front of the TV. Yeah, exactly. Now, are you much of a Halloween guy? You going to get dressed up or anything like that?
I have before. I'm not this year. I think my kids are excited about their own stuff and didn't drag us in.
I would imagine, and this is not funny, I'm being serious, when you're a former NFL offensive tackle, buying a Halloween costume off the rack is not always the easiest thing to do, right? I mean, Chewbacca, you can be Chewbacca, but you can't necessarily be every potential character because some of this stuff is a little bit more...
Pretty limiting,
yeah.
Right? So we were the Star Wars family one year. My wife was Padme, and daughter was the old lady. What's the lady's name?
Princess Leia?
Princess Leia, okay. Unreal. And Mason was a stormtrooper.
There you go.
And so I went to, I think it was Walmart, get the Darth Vader onesie.
Oh, wow.
And it was tight. It
Yeah.
was like the Euro cut. You could see most of my calf.
That's tough.
It stopped mid-form.
That's tough. It's one of those things where one size all becomes one size fits most.
Yeah, that's right. It did not fit all, and I'm sorry for the people that were subjected to it, but we had a good time.
Speaking of having a good time, we're going to do that here over the course of the next 30 minutes, looking ahead to Georgia, Florida on Saturday. I know many of you looking forward to being a part of the action in Jacksonville here this weekend. And, John, I've been kind of wrestling with this all week long. I started our program Dog Nation Daily on Monday by saying I really feel like that up to this point in time, this is the most important game that Kirby Smart's coached at Georgia. Now, if you win that, you unlock some other games, some other potential possibilities here for this season. But in terms of what's at stake if Georgia loses, I don't think any game has risen to this level for Smart yet. Rose Bowl, it's more of a, boy, it's just kind of cool to be here. And lo and behold, Georgia wins it. National championship game the following week, it was still this kind of surreal feeling of, oh my gosh, this is Kirby's second year and Georgia's playing for national championship. Even last year of the SEC championship, there's a certain sense of still Kirby Smart's third season, just kind of getting going here. It's really 2019 that we were all pointing to last December. Well, 2019's here right now, and all of a sudden Florida, maybe a little bit better thus far than some of us would have assumed. Maybe Georgia, on the basis of the fact that it's already lost a game, maybe a little bit more vulnerable than some of us would have imagined. There's something to be gained by winning. I think there's something at stake if Georgia loses in terms of some tough questions that might be asked about offensive personality and everything like that. Because of that, I just think this Georgia-Florida game on Saturday has tremendous ramifications. You could say the same thing for Florida, but frankly, I don't care about their storyline quite as much. Do you join me on this? Do you join me in saying that, man, rivalry game, hated opponent, stakes don't get any higher? I mean, where do you kind of come down on that?
I think the stakes are really high for the perception of Kirby Smart. I think that you look at last year's SEC championship game, the stakes were really high. I think on the year prior, Georgia had put themselves in that national discussion and expectations were high. The perception that Georgia had arrived and was prepared for that opportunity was all in place. Now this game holds a different story, and I think the implications are just as high, and the stakes are higher for Coach Smart because for the first time, in my opinion, a loss paints a new picture for him and for this team. So before you lose SEC championship game like they did last year, there's still hope for 2019. This team is still young. It's still an arrow up organization, and there's still everyone is on the Kirby Smart bandwagon.
Yeah.
I think you lose this game, and all of a sudden, the questions come into play of can we not make it? Are we not across the hurdle?
Yeah.
Are we not as far down the road as people thought we were? Now you win it, and you no longer have that issue. You're looking more towards the Auburn game and what's ahead.
Yeah, for Georgia fans, no one's happier when you win, no one's sadder when you lose. And
That's it.
We'll see this go one of the two directions on Saturday. I want to be very clear about one thing, too. And, John, I know you're going to agree with me on this. Let's say the worst-case scenario were to happen and Georgia were to lose this game on Saturday. I don't think the who changes whatsoever. We know that Kirby Smart's the best leader for this program. That's going to be true, I believe, for many years to come. The who doesn't change. I think the how could change just a little bit. Kirby's definitely the right answer to who should lead Georgia, but how should Georgia be led? Some of the strategies and the tactics employed, we may be debating some of that more than Kirby Smart wants to. So it's not a question of who if Georgia loses, but the question of how the Bulldogs are choosing to get it done. I do think that kind of comes to the forefront more if UGA loses. Hopefully it's a conversation we don't have to have, but that's at least a clarifying point I wanted to make.
Agreed. I think the question is not whether or not Georgia should be led by Kirby Smart if they lose to Florida. I think that's a ridiculous statement.
Right.
I think Kirby has done an unbelievable job of getting this program pointed in an even better direction, where the bar was set at 10-win minimum when Coach Rick left. I mean, that's what we're talking about here is we want to be competing for national championships and feel like Kirby's the guy who can lead us there. And I think he's put us in that conversation. He's earned the right to say he's progressed this program, not only in recruits, but performance on the field. And a loss to Florida doesn't change that. But I think you painted it really well, and it's not who, but how, especially referring to the offense. Coach Smart is a defensive-minded coach. That's where he's cut his teeth, and that's where he makes hay. And so really you're talking about how it gets done on the offensive side of the ball.
We are going to hear from Georgia coach Kirby Smart in a moment on what makes Georgia, Florida, and Jacksonville so unique. We'll hear from them there on our Marlow's matchup. Great to have this part of our program. John Stinchcomb, the former UGA All-American, myself, Brandon Adams. Let me do one more thing on the game before we get to Kirby on his feelings about what you have to encounter when you go into this neutral site venue. When you look at what happened to Georgia last year against LSU, when you look at what happened to Georgia 2 years before that against Auburn. Take the Alabama games out of this for a moment because Alabama is so deep and talented. That's almost its own storyline for how you beat Alabama. But when Georgia has been beaten by other teams, the recipe always kind of seems to come down to Georgia doesn't quite get as many rushing yards as it's used to getting. Georgia gives up a few more rushing yards than it wants to give up. That was kind of the recipe for the LSU game, for the Auburn game in 2017. You may say the same thing about the Sugar Bowl to the extent that that matters at the end of last season. When I look at Florida, I assume the same thing's true here as well. If Georgia runs the ball and stops the run, then my guess is no matter how much we've debated the passing game, Georgia probably wins. If P. Ryan, the running game, kind of gets going a little bit more, has a little bit more success, if Georgia puts itself in a situation where Florida anticipates the run and stacks the box to stop it, all of a sudden this becomes a little bit more of a nerve-wracking game deep into the fourth quarter. Am I oversimplifying it by saying that Georgia loses when it gives up rushing yards and it doesn't produce them? This game kind of comes down to that.
Yeah, that's how I see it. I think it boils down to, can Georgia stop Florida's run game? And that's not the biggest threat. Florida is probably a better passing team than run attack. But if you make a team one-dimensional, I think Georgia has the defensive personnel and the philosophy to shutting down any one-dimensional threat offense. What Florida could do is if they create a little run game, well, then you have to change your approach a little bit. You can't lay your ears back and come off the edges. That might be a problem for Georgia. Now, they stop the run, make Florida one-dimensional. I like the chances of Georgia's defense, and they've shown that that's playing right into their strength. Now, to flip to the other side of the ball, if Georgia can mix in a variety of rushing attacks, and I think we started to see a little more of that against Kentucky, more so than we definitely did against South Carolina, but threaten the edges and get the ball outside in the run game, that's a different way of attacking a defense. I think it opens up some of the passing attack and takes a little pressure off those wide receivers that have been taking a beating for 2 or 3 weeks now from the media, and some of it's earned. I mean, they haven't been able to get away from press man coverage, and I think they can take some of that ownership. So you get a good rushing attack, and I think that's the key to victory for Georgia against Florida.
Before we hear from Georgia coach Kirby Smart, let me remind you that on our Marlow's matchup, we're looking forward to being live again on location very soon. The week of the Auburn game, we're going to be at the Marlow's right there in Brookhaven. It's 3575 Durden Drive in the Brookhaven location for Marlow's. That's 6 to 8 p.m. on Thursday, November 14th. So that's Marlow's Brookhaven, 3575 Durden Drive, the Brookhaven location there. We'll be there getting you ready for Georgia-Auburn, hopefully talking about Georgia trying to stay alive in that college football playoff race, moving on to the SEC championship, preserving an 11-1 regular season. A lot of fun conversations opened up for us at the Marlow's in Brookhaven, assuming that Georgia takes care of its business against Florida, and that's exactly what we'll hope to see Georgia do, and hope to see you there on Thursday, November 14th for us live at the Marlow's in Brookhaven for our Marlow's matchup. All right, let's hear from Kirby Smart here for a moment, because talked when he met with reporters last night, or I should say Tuesday night, about a lot of the issues when it comes to the Georgia-Florida game. The pageantry of around the stadium, going over that Hart Bridge, and you can tell more about that, John, having played in this rivalry. The feeling of the 50-50 split among the fans, and the fact that it kind of feels like a bowl game during the regular season, and so many Georgia fans for such a long time have treated it as such. Kirby has certainly been honest that he likes the idea of recruiting a big home game, maybe playing Florida on campus in the near future, but for now, he certainly appreciates what makes Georgia-Florida different, and he talked about that this week. Take a look at this.
I mean, that's what makes it a rivalry, you know. You got so much at stake. So, I mean, I really don't think that it would matter if it was about the SEC East or not. It's Georgia-Florida. So that in itself carries a lot of weight. The game, the history, the tradition, the fact you have a Hall of Fame for the game alone, and players can be remembered for their performances in that game alone is pretty big. But the SEC East is always, you know, it weighs heavily into this game. I wouldn't say it determines it all the time.
Is there anything about this game, whether it's to drive in, the split stadium, whatever, that kind of stands out to you as something, as a player and as a coach, that makes it unique and makes it fun?
Yeah, that's probably the most unique thing is the split 50-50 because it's weird. You know, you have a weird feeling in there sometimes. It's so different than I call it a pro mentality because people aren't – there's no, like, student section. They're chanting for you or against you when you come out to warm up. It's not like that. The atmosphere in pregame is very different. It's a different feel because when you go out pregame at a road game, it's like I'm in enemy territory. When you go out in your place, you're in friendly confines, but there's a lot more energy and buzz. And it seems like at this game, the times I've played in it and coached in it, it's more flat in warm-ups, and then all of a sudden, boom, you come out for the game, and everybody's in their seat. They come in at the same time as opposed to being in there early.
So I think that's really interesting from Kirby Smart, talking about kind of how you approach this, the fact that it feels a little bit different on the outside. You're obviously, you know, plane travel, which is not that different than some of the other games you might play, but the 50-50 split of the fans, there's a Hall of Fame associated with Georgia, Florida. It really does make for an interesting environment, and given the fact that you get a new crop of players coming into this every year, I would imagine that one of the, maybe we don't talk about this enough, the untold storylines of how a game like this plays out is, which of these two coaches is better at explaining what the atmosphere is going to be like for freshmen who haven't been here before, and for guys who've been on the roster but haven't been in a key spot, you know, with the pressure on in a game like this, what's it going to feel like when you have to handle that on the field for the first time? That's a job for both these coaches, right?
It's unique. This game is set up different, and Coach Smart hits it. It's not like a regular home game. It's not like a regular road game. The best analogy in college football is it's a mid-season bowl game. I think that's a perfect illustration. So as a player, you come in, you see the pageantry of the game. You do come over the bridge. You see the fans reveling in the pregame atmosphere, which is it ends in some extra energy in the stadium. Now, like he said, some fans are late to show because they're still getting their pregame on.
That's right, yeah.
And don't arrive till game is about to kick off.
It's also, as speaking as a fan, this can also be a very difficult stadium to get in the stadium on narrow corridors. It's been remodeled, but it's still kind of an older stadium. Sometimes hard to get through the turnstiles. For some fans, actually getting from outside to inside can be a little bit of a difficult challenge.
Oh, especially with the stumbling. You know, there's plenty of that. So.
That does make it a little bit more difficult.
Yes, it does. The stadium's a little blurry, but no, as a player, I mean, it's got its own atmosphere. It's surprising how many former guys that you don't see with regularity come that you recognize on the sideline, similar to you would a bowl game.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you look up and there's Bill Goldberg or Herschel Walker
Right.
in the locker room. It's got a different atmosphere, and I think preparation is a big piece of that. Our senior year playing in this game, Coach Richt had in the locker room playing on repeat Phil Collins' classic of "I Can Feel It Coming Through the Air Tonight." I mean, it's got a different feel than any other regular season game.
You're too young, or to have played in the '98 game that Goldberg led Georgia out. Georgia doesn't win that day with the Black Pants. Did you play the Black Pants game? You're too young for that, right?
No, I watched that from homecoming.
Okay, yeah.
My brother was in that game.
Okay, there you go. So the Black Pants kind of cool. The outcome of the game, maybe not quite so much. Goldberg did lead him out there that day, and I can't remember if you and I talked about this on Monday or not, but I do believe that one of the things that I feel like I know about Kirby Smart is that whatever the emotion is supposed to be, I think Smart's pretty good at finding that in a way that some coaches might accidentally turn up the heat a little too much, turn up the volume a little too much, and all of a sudden you either peak too early in the week or you're just, I don't know, too excitable on game day. Smart seems to be, you know, public word's different than private words, of course, but Smart seems to be pretty good at pacing the 2 weeks for this game. Last week when he met with the reporters, very little talk about Florida. If you hear him say it, they were only working on other opponents. They're only working on themselves. They're only working on things like that. This week, it's a lot of, well, Florida's no different for us than any other game we play. We have to treat every game like it's a rivalry. And yet we'll also see these private videos that get leaked from time to time that day before the game, night before the game, sometimes Smart's not quite as buttoned up with some of the things that he likes to say, and the day before a game, that's probably a little bit more appropriate. I guess what I'm saying is that for all the things we say about Smart's coaching profile, I think this aspect of it, at least the best that I can understand it, not being a former player, the best that I can understand it, he seems to be pretty good at knowing how much emotion and when to turn it up.
And I think that's fair. I think he is, as a former player, is aware, especially in college football, emotions play a big role in any game and how you come into the game. I think of two of the last losses this team has suffered. The energy probably wasn't there going into South Carolina. It's a noon game. Yeah. It's an unmenacing opponent, similar to what you saw in the Sugar Bowl, where you're going up against Texas, and they probably weren't getting the respect that they had earned, mainly because Georgia still felt like they should have been in the college football playoffs. I don't think you have that same atmosphere going into this game. It's actually an ideal, in my opinion, situation in that they have the talent in the locker room, in Georgia's locker room, and there's plenty of bulletin board material saying, you know, this is an opponent that's ranked higher than you. There's so much being said about your lack of focus and not performing well on offense. There's a lot at stake, and you've got an opportunity to almost come in as an underdog with a really talented football team. I think those are some really good ingredients if you're Coach Smart and this Georgia team going into the game.
So let's talk about something a little more tangible here for a moment. The emotions obviously play a big role in this, but there's also some institutional knowledge each side has but the other. For Georgia, that comes by way of not just playing Florida every year, but also having Charlton Warren as defensive backs coach, given the fact that Warren was in Gainesville working that same job a year prior. For Florida, Brenton Cox, the only five-star member of the Florida roster right now, although not eligible to play on Saturday, having just transferred. He's also seemingly got some knowledge about UGA. You and I talked about that on Monday when you're with us on Dog Nation Daily. The impact of both these guys, Warren as a coach, Cox as I don't want to say spy, but someone who was a part of Georgia practices this season and now standing on the Florida sideline on Saturday. What will the impact of that be in this game? Well, Kirby Smart also talked about that this week, and I think that sets up John to kind of have some interesting things to say there as well. So watch this as part of our Marlow's matchup.
It means a lot. I think the history that our staff has from the years on the West going against Dan, he probably watches countless films of the times we've gone against each other, and we do the same as far as schemes and things like that. Now, personnel, I think obviously there's personnel there that he knows or he's gone against, and sometimes that can be beneficial, sometimes it's not, because you don't know how matchups are going to work. How's the left guard, right guard, center, left receiver, right receiver, tight end going to match up on certain guys. He's seen more of them because he sees them every day in practice. But it's very similar to Chaney. I don't know how much that helps or hurts.
Do you worry about the same thing with Brenton Cox and sort of a reverse, especially since he was with the team in the spring and first parts of fall practice?
Not really. I mean, you don't concern yourself with things you can't control. And, I mean, they got film, so they can watch and see what we do. You know what I mean? So it's not like there's secrets out there when it's on tape.
So it's not surprising to hear, for the most part, Smart downplay that on both sides. I guess the one thing that does come to mind is, John, I'm a little bit of a baseball fan. Or I'm not a little bit, I'm a big baseball fan. And one of the things you see in Major League Baseball be a bigger deal now than it used to be is the idea of tipping pitches or second baseman recognizing a signal from the catcher. That kind of information, if you can gain it, does seem to have an advantage. In the NFL, you see some of that stealing signal stuff sometimes, going on there as well. So obviously these games are more won by how players execute more so than secretive game plans. But, I wonder if the actual truth of this matter is maybe more significant than Smart lets on. Warren having been at Florida, maybe he does know some of the nuclear launch codes. Cox having been at Georgia, maybe he does know a little something. Given the way that sometimes this plays out in other sports, I wonder if it couldn't maybe have a role in this game on Saturday as well. As a former player, how do you respond to that?
I think you see it more manifested in the micro than the macro. Like Coach Smart said, everybody knows your schemes. Everybody knows the plays that you run. What changes is the execution thereof. For Brenton Cox and the inside information, what they do know is what your strengths and weaknesses are to a person. I think the personnel evaluation is much higher when you've got familiarity and when you've seen the guys practice, when you've seen them make their breaks in their routes, and you know what they're really good at and what they're not so great at. You can start to pick up on these things. Now, being able to relay that information to guys that can actually use it, not everybody can execute that really well. I mean, we've had in the NFL, there were guys that had come from other teams and they would provide information where you think, well, I could pick that up from watching film. I mean, he likes to go to, I played offensive line, so I'm watching the D line. Well, he likes to go speed to power on his rushes. Well, no kidding, I watch film too.
Right, yeah.
But if you pick up on, well, here's how he comes out of the break. We always had to work on a guy dropping his arm when he's making his inside breaks, whatever that might be. This tackle, when he sets up in a three-point stance, I could tell whether it's run or pass by the angle of his knee. That stuff's helpful. If I'm looking at a defensive end, all of a sudden, he likes to bring his feet a little more parallel. You should watch for that because he's making some more line games on ET stunts. That stuff can be helpful. He really struggles with this move. Those kind of things are advantageous, but it's to a person. It's whether or not your guard or your nose guard can use that information and apply it to their game and their execution on Saturday, but it's not the big scheme stuff that's going to be effective.
Let me take this a step further for a second with the two coaches who obviously have a long track record against each other, even going back to when Smart was defensive coordinator in Alabama. If you and I are playing poker together, it would stand to reason if I have a strong hand, it might benefit me to pretend that I have a weak hand. But if you saw me acting like I had a weak hand, you might assume that I really have a strong hand. So therefore, I've got to counterbalance what the assumption you're making is. All of a sudden, we're 2 or 3 moves down the board here. With Smart and Mullen, I'm assuming it's the same way, although I've never been in the position these two coaches will find themselves on Saturday. Mullen knows what Kirby's thinking from having coached against him before, but since Kirby knows what Mullen's thinking, he now has a responsibility of doing something a little different, I guess. The chess match here, offensive guy, defensive guy, long track record, not just countering each other's moves, but also potentially providing a counter to the counter and maybe running against the expectation for the other guy. That is a fun storyline, and it's the kind of thing that if you didn't have a vested interest in the winner, you'd be really entertained by watching these two guys go head-to-head. But that's also a part of this, right?
Absolutely. It reminds me of Princess Bride. You ever watch that?
Oh, of course.
Who's got
right? Yeah, of course,
powder?
of course.
Sure. But there is some gamesmanship and there is some familiarity. I think both are great college coaches that have competed against each other, and you try to prepare your team and knowing that they're going to read not only what you say but what the other coaches are saying. So there is some gamesmanship that's being played. I think not only in the offseason, we saw plenty of that, but leading into game week where you want to get your guys focused on the right things, and you start to verbally spar, even if it's not in the same sit-down negotiation at the same table, but you're playing off what's being fed to you and trying to relay that information and get your team focused in the right ways.
We're going to hear one more comment from Kirby Smart on Georgia, Florida before we're done here as part of our Marlow's matchup. But if you're just joining us, let me remind you of a couple things. We do this show live each and every Thursday, except for this Thursday. At Halloween night, John and I lucky enough to be able to spend some time with our families and our children. So we appreciate you allowing us to kind of come to you in a less than live form. We'll get back to our typical format of talking to you with your comments and everything else again next week. So thanks for being with us. A little bit different version of the Marlow's matchup here this week. And by the way, the week after that, really excited. If you're just joining us, let me remind you again that we're going to be back on the road again very soon for a Marlow's matchup live on location. The Marlow's in Brookhaven. It's the week of the Auburn game, getting ready for the Deep South's oldest rivalry. I got to think about all these rivalry names between the world's largest outdoor cocktail party and clean old-fashioned hate. Deep South's oldest rivalry. We'll be getting ready for that on Thursday, November 14th, from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Marlow's in Brookhaven. That's 3575 Durden Drive. Always one of our favorite spots to be at. They've got a great patio. Enjoy the chef-inspired food, the craft cocktails. I'm sure if you show up in red and black, there's a chance you might get a complimentary appetizer there as well. So just get ready to enjoy yourself for a fun time at Marlow's in Brookhaven with us on Thursday, November 14th, or any Marlow's right there in your neighborhood. The Tavern will be opening up and enjoying some very, very, very special events here this fall. Great time to be out and about in the patios of Marlow's during this fall time of year, so check out the one that is closest to you. All right, one more thing I want to hear from Kirby Smart on today's program. In discussing the way that recruiting impacts who wins this game and also impacts maybe future recruiting classes as well. For a lot of the Florida players, they were recruited by Georgia. A lot of the Georgia players were recruited by Florida. There is a lot of overlap when it comes to that, and Smart also talked about that this week. Take a look and listen to this.
It says we recruit against them a lot. I mean, it seems like there's every player that's on their roster we were at least in contact with, or maybe they still got guys playing that were recruited under the other staff, where most of ours are under ours. But I think both places recruited, probably 80% of these kids overlapped. They were probably in the final, 4 teams. So it makes, it makes you probably as a player want to win more if you almost went there. And there's also the overlap of they recruit our state and we recruit their state. They've got quite a few Georgia kids. We've got quite a few Florida kids. And those kids want to win, obviously, because they got to go home and live and see in their communities. So it makes it, I think anytime you're border rivalry, it's that much more. We just have a lot of those.
There's a specific point I want to make about this. I think it's not a coincidence that we haven't seen a close game in this rivalry since 2013, that the winning team, it hasn't always been Georgia, but the winning team, going back to 2013, has won comfortably. Prior to that, there was a stretch of games that were pretty close, but then you kind of get to the heyday of the Urban Meyer era, or the heyday of the Steve Spurrier era, or before that, the heyday of the Vince Dooley era. Once again, games not always really close. There are a few nail-biters and classics, but for the most part, the winning team has kind of dominated in this rivalry. That's especially been true over the last few years. And for the reasons that Smart just explained, I think this is more than a coincidence. I think that Georgia being good is a problem for Florida. Look at the current commit list for UGA. Carson Beck, Florida would have loved to have had him. He's from their home state. Jalen Carter, Florida would love to have had him. He's from their own state. Warren Brenson goes to IMG Academy. That's a guy that Florida would have loved to have had. Georgia being good, Florida being bad, made it easier for those guys to pick UGA. Conversely, when it's the Urban Meyer era of dominance, the Georgia brand down in South Georgia, where so many elite recruits come from, that Georgia brand's not quite as shiny when Florida's on top in this rivalry. And even if all those players don't end up going to Florida, they go somewhere other than Georgia, which makes it easier for Florida to win. the ways in which these two teams overlapping recruiting the way they do, I think it explains why in this zero-sum game that the SEC can be, why the winning team not only wins, but it has a tendency to win comfortably because of how much damage you do to your opponent when you can put a series of wins together in this rivalry.
I couldn't agree more. I think they're two so talent-rich states that it's important for you to have some chip over the other. I mean, if Georgia can stretch that score out and you're competing for those same 4- and 5-star kids that you don't want to see on Saturday, you'd much rather have them in your locker room, that matters to them. And you know, if you've got two teams that are equal, well, that makes it a little more challenging to recruit. Whereas if you can dominate somebody, you'd say, well, why would you want to go there? You're not going to be able to compete at the level we will. So I think the opportunity for that really leans heavily towards Georgia and has in the past few years, and you can see the way it's played out in some of the recruits that have come close in that Georgia-Florida battle as to where they'll sign. And, you know, if you want to continue in those top 3, top 5 classes like Georgia's experienced under Coach Smart, it's important for this game to, you know, one, you got to win it, and two, if you get the opportunity, you want to exploit that, and for recruiting reasons, if not just that it's a bitter rival.
I want to get a final thought from you in the game here in a moment. I also want to remind you, as part of our Marlow's matchup, when you tune in, one of the things you always see, something that John and I both love, the hover helmet here. Spinning around, shining, the Georgia G's never look better. And for those of you that want to have every piece of UGA memorabilia or gear imaginable for your basement or for your office, whatever else, the hover helmet's the next really cool thing to have. And Hover Helmet's also offering great savings for you right now, too, on the UGA Hover Helmet. But you've got to go to hoverhelmets.com and then use DogNation, your promo code. So basically, it's hoverhelmets.com/DogNation. Then use DogNation as your promo code. When you do that, you get great savings on this. We're coming up on the holiday season time of year. There are a lot of you that have Georgia fans in your family. They're hard to buy for. I can promise you this. You make them really, really happy this holiday season when you get the UGA Hover Helmet, and they're in stock now. They're taking your orders. They'll be shipped to you, and you can get that thing delivered. Hoverhelmets.com/DogNation. Use the promo code DogNation to get big savings on the Georgia Hover Helmet from our friends at Hover Helmets. The website right there on your screen for that. So, John, I want a final thought from you, but let me give one here this way. Admittedly, speaking as a fan here for a moment, I was disappointed in how the Georgia offense played versus South Carolina. That's not a loss I could have ever imagined Georgia suffering. The Kentucky game, given the fact that it came the week after that and the rain and everything that impacted that game, kind of left me wanting a little bit too. Hard to know, just how much Georgia was impacted by the weather. It was clearly impacted some. And there was a sense of, I'm not quite really sure where Georgia is on all of this as you head towards that bye week in Florida. However, the disappointment of the Gamecocks loss, whatever the Kentucky game was, has not changed my overall feeling that this is still a coaching staff that I trust. This is still a group of players that I have great confidence in, and I'm assuming that they blossom against Florida. My assumption is, and maybe this is more based on hope than facts, which is fine, but my assumption is we see a better version of Georgia versus Florida maybe we've seen at any point in time this year. I think the bye week comes at the right time. I think that Georgia's still the more talented of the two teams. I think that Kirby Smart in head-to-head matchups has proven himself to be superior to Mullen when it has kind of mattered most. I trust that enough to trust Georgia in this game. What are your feelings on this now that we're only a couple of days out?
I agree. I wish you hadn't stolen my thunder on that, BA, but I think the South Carolina game played out the worst possible way that it could for Georgia's offense, and you start to raise questions that otherwise wouldn't be there. If you don't have 4 turnovers, if you don't have 2 field goal situations that don't go your way, if you don't handle the 2-minute drill at the end of the half, at the end of the game the way you do, you don't lose that game. Mm-hmm. And then you say, oh, there's things we can clean up, but I still have complete faith in this team, this entire team. The defense, I think, is special. I think Coach Smart was very smart to go about it and say, oh, this was atrocious, and I'm glad we won it the way we did. But to keep them fired up, that defense is playing at a really high level. Yeah. And the offense has all the pieces. It's putting them together. I still have a lot of faith in this team and think that they're going to come out and it's not going to be close at the end of the day. I think it's going to be Georgia by leaps and bounds. I could be wrong. I think what we talked about on Monday, there is a very evident split There are some, the numbers folks seem to lean more towards Georgia, and those that are looking at these last 2 weeks in performances, which have not been impressive, weren't impressive against South Carolina. It was a rain-drenched game where you weren't able to throw the ball effectively, and it didn't look good against Kentucky, but I am still very much on the bandwagon and say that this could still materialize as a great year for Georgia.
We hope all of you enjoy the game on Saturday. We appreciate you being a part of Marlow's matchup here this weekend. Make sure you check out a Marlow's Tavern near you to enjoy all the chef-inspired food, the craft cocktails, and then we'll see you a couple weeks at the Marlow's there in Brookhaven for a live edition of our Marlow's matchup. For now, though, I'll see you tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. for more of Dog Nation Daily, and of course in Jacksonville throughout the weekend for Dog Nation Invasion and so much more. You'll have a great evening. Happy Halloween. Thanks for being a part of the Marlow's matchup.